Mark Cameron, Executive Vice President for External Relations of the Oil Sands Net Zero by 2050 Pathways Alliance, was recently in Egypt for COP27. So I'm going to talk to him about his experiences there. So welcome to the interview, Mark.
Thanks. Great to be here, Markham.
Now, you no doubt saw some of the coverage of the oil and gas industry being in COP27. There was some criticism of that. Why did the Pathways Alliance, why were you in COP27? What did you do and how were you received?
Sure. Well, I think there's a bit of a misconception. There was a couple of articles saying that there was, 600 oil and gas lobbyists at COP, and I think the impression given is that people were there trying to water down government's positions in the negotiations, et cetera. That really has nothing to do with it. I mean, COP is a really massive gathering of about 30,000 plus people. And a lot of them are really there to share information and learn. We were there to talk about carbon capture and storage, talk about our own net zero commitment, learn from what's going on in other countries, learn what's going on, whether it's in Australia or Africa or China, and just to compare notes and compare ideas around technology and where this is going.
So, what was the response? I mean, you were there primarily to talk about CCUS because CCUS seems to be the industry's main strategy in the sort of medium to long term to reduce its emissions. And did you have a chance to talk to other countries, about CCUS?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say that CCUS is probably the main strategy in the short to medium term. In the long term, there's other technologies. But yeah, we were talking to people from around the world in different sectors, whether steel or cement or fertilizer, about what they're doing and what's going on in India, what's going on in Africa. So CCUS is definitely something that has a lot of momentum, not just in Canada, but around the world. And I think it's really seen as part of any viable net zero solution has to include a large quantity of CCUS.
Now, there's a fair amount of controversy about CCUS being applied to the oil sands, one of which is the ask from governments, primarily, I guess, Alberta and the federal government for funding to help pay for that, and especially because the oil sands companies are so profitable at the moment. Where are we at with that in negotiations, and what kind of funding are we talking about here, Mark?
Well, there's really a couple of things that are being discussed. First of all, there was the investment tax credit that was announced by the federal government a couple of years ago, which they're working towards legislating sometime this year or early next year. Then there are discussions with Alberta around the royalty system and how that would apply to these kinds of investments, whether they'd be inside the ring fence, outside the ring fence, et cetera. Then there are other programs like the Net Zero Accelerator that are open to other industries, but we would certainly hope to participate in those programs. And then the big remaining question is how long-term credit pricing would apply to the oil sands, CCUS and the oil sands or other industries. And that's where you get discussion around ideas like contracts for difference. So it's really a combination of all those things that would have to fall into place to make these investments viable. But one thing I would say is that we're all around the world where these kinds of investments are happening or being considered. There are usually substantial government involvement. In the U.S., the 45Q tax credit, which was recently expanded with the Inflation Reduction Act, that is at least double in value what the investment tax credit is worth in Canada, and the amounts that have been given to the Longships program in Norway or the Porthos project in the Netherlands are 2/3 to 3/4 of their costs, both capital and operating. So what we've been talking about with the federal and provincial government here in Canada is really no different than anywhere else around the world.
Oh, okay, fair enough. But I think it could be argued that in Norway, for example, Equinor is involved in that in a big way, but they're also owned by the government, and they also have a $1 trillion sovereign wealth fund that they can tap to pay for
Yeah.
those in a way that Canada can't. We never had that. We don't have that. Doesn't even, and even the Heritage Fund in Alberta is not anywhere near that size. So let's talk about numbers, because it wasn't that long ago. It was in 2021. A couple of your CEOs said very publicly that this was likely to be a $75 billion project out to 2050, and they'd hope the government would cover 2/3 of it, so $50 billion. Are those still the kind of numbers we're talking about?
I mean, I think when all in, that's probably the ballpark, but that includes the entire project. So that includes things that we haven't even developed yet, like small modular reactors and direct air capture and things like that. But that's the aggregate project out to 2050. But that's the scale of investment that is required if we're actually going to achieve net zero in the oil sands, which is one of Canada's largest emitting sectors.
Right. Well, okay. So, do we know that the oil sands industry can actually be competitive by 2050? Because let's just hypothetically here, the federal government, mostly maybe some Alberta government money comes in. It's 50. It turns out to be $50 billion. And worst case scenario, the oil sands are not competitive, and they either have to shut production in, stop producing from different projects, and essentially you have stranded assets. Not only the producing assets, now you have the infrastructure assets, like the carbon capture equipment, the pipelines, and wherever you're going to bury this stuff. What's your take on that?
Well, I mean, if you look at the oil sands industry and the amount that it's providing to the Canadian economy overall, it's about $1 trillion per decade. And if we were to simply gradually reduce that to zero between now and 2050, rather than $3 trillion of GDP, it would contribute only about $800 million of GDP, $800 billion rather GDP. So that's about a $2 trillion gap. And that's, regardless of what happens after 2050, even in between now and 2050. That's about a $2 billion gap in total GDP, and that would apply to Alberta royalties, would apply to federal income tax, would apply to employment. So a $75 billion investment to secure $2 trillion in economic activity is actually a pretty reasonable bet. And then we don't really know today what the size of the oil market will be in 2050 and beyond. Is it going to be 25 million barrels a day? Is it going to be 50 million barrels a day? Or what it will be used for? Will it still be used for transportation, or will it be used for other things like asphalt and petrochemicals and other products?
Well, we don't know, because nobody knows the future. And as we know from Russia's invasion of Ukraine, things can turn on a dime. So fair enough on that. But I know that your members have modeled. Companies have internal modeling that provide the scenarios out to different scenarios out to 2050, and it shows that the oil sands can be competitive. But you don't share that modeling with the government, or certainly not publicly. So it's hard to have this conversation about whether the industry is going to be competitive or not competitive when the Americans model like crazy. I mean, they model everything, and that information is publicly available, and it's made available to policymakers. Will the oil sands companies make their modeling available so that we can check the assumptions, that sort of thing?
Sure. And I mean, this is a tricky question. A lot of those models are proprietary, and we don't even share that within Pathways. So, Suncor and Imperial don't necessarily have the same modeling. We have aggregated modeling that we use, but we're using sort of publicly available information and so on. And we have discussed that kind of information with government, and probably at some point we would make some of that modeling publicly available. But right now these are pretty closely held discussions between federal, provincial government, and industry. So.
Okay. I mean, we have argued at Energy Media. I have argued in columns that to make the kind of decisions, the investment decisions or the funding decisions that industry is asking of government, that the government has to have all the information available to it. And voters, I would argue, should have that information too, so they should know whether they support the government's decisions or not support them, and so that would argue for more transparency and making that modeling available, or funding somebody else to do that, independent third-party economists to do the modeling, just so we can talk intelligently about these things, and then not as hypothetically as we are
Sure.
now, at least people like I am, because we don't have it. Okay, well, look, so we're at the point now, Mark, where you've made the argument for the 50 billion that because it enables so much production and such a high contribution to the national economy that it's in best interest to for the federal government and the Alberta government to fund CCUS for the oil sands. But isn't this just kind of like a preserving the status quo? I mean, what else can the oil sands industry do if you get carbon capture, utilization, and storage? What about the U in that equation?
Well, I think that is one of those things that we're looking at in the 2030s and beyond is what are the other potential uses of bitumen? And, Alberta Innovates has a big program on bitumen beyond combustion, which we're very interested in. So we're certainly looking all the time at what are the products. We're looking at the potential products with captured carbon. That would be an awful lot of Coca-Cola to put all those carbon bubbles in. But we're certainly looking for what the opportunities are there.
Okay, so within the oil sands industry, so there's 4 big companies and 1 smaller company, Meg Energy. Of those companies, Suncor has invested in startups like Enerchem and LanzaJet that use captured CO2. But the other companies don't. So when you say we're looking at this, what do you exactly mean?
Sure.
Because now this, I just want a little background, a little context for our viewers. The European major oil companies are going at this in a big way. Suncor is doing it in Canada in a, sort of a smaller, but okay, we'll give them credit for that. But the other companies aren't. So are we talking about a change in attitude by those other companies, Mark?
I mean, I guess I would dispute the characterization. I mean, Suncor has done a lot of really positive things, but I think you can look at, CNRL and Cenovus and Imperial are all investing in various kinds of clean tech or startups or investments. There's a big, biofuels project that Imperial is working on. Cenovus is a partner in EVOC Innovation. So there's lots of examples of where all those companies, I mean, collectively, those companies have put $10 billion into R&D in the last 10 years, $1.8 billion to develop over 1,000 technologies through COSIA, and that certainly represents all of the companies within Pathways, not just one of them.
Right. Okay, fair enough. But COSIA, I mean, the technologies that were developed partly through COSIA are mainly around increasing the efficiencies of production, solvents substitution,
Sure.
technologies for the tailings ponds. I mean, on and on and on to make the companies more efficient, lower their production costs. Most of them were not looking ahead to energy transition issues,
Sure.
what we can do with CO2, et cetera.
Well, I mean, COSIA actually has a pretty active climate and CO2 side of its operations, but in solvent technology, it can be used to improve efficiency, but it can also be used to reduce emissions. So there are technologies that are dual use. Sometimes by being more efficient, you can also be less polluting. And there's definitely, there's a lot of energy efficiency and electrification projects going on again across all the companies that would have that dual effect of both improving operations and reducing emissions.
Okay, so what percentage of emission reduction, and we should point out that the Pathways Alliance, if I understand this correctly, Mark, has committed to 24 megatons out of the 70 it emits every year, 24 megatons of emissions reductions by 2030. Have I got that correct?
Well, 22 is the target.
22. I was being a little generous to you. Come on
Yeah.
now. Okay, so 22 and 10 of those that we know are going to come from Suncor because Suncor is already committed to that publicly. So 12 from the other companies. Is that going to, if it's not CCUS, what other technologies are they going to bring to the table to reduce those emissions?
I think in the pre-2030 period, it'll be probably 10 to 12 megatons through CCUS, and the rest would be a combination of energy efficiency, electrification, solvents that reduce the steam production and therefore reduce the natural gas used in producing steam, and fuel switching like the coke boiler replacement that Suncor is doing. All those collectively add up to the 22 megatons.
Okay. We're just on the cusp of 2023. So we basically got 7 years left in this decade. Is the timeline too tight? That's one of the arguments I've heard
Sure.
is that these are big companies. These are huge industrial operations. They don't turn on a dime. They don't produce. They don't make investments quickly. So I guess the question is there enough time to hit the targets by 2030?
It's a tight timeline. There's no question. Like we would have to submit a regulatory application to build the pipeline from Fort McMurray to Cold Lake by late next year. We'd probably actually have to be procuring pipe or at least reserving it by early 2024. So these are very tight timelines, which is why the discussions with government around whether it's the financial issues or the regulatory issues are really crucial. But if everything falls into place, yes, we can do it by 2030, but it is going to be a tight crunch.
Well, what do you need government to do more quickly? Is it just the policy and the regulatory piece? What do they need to do?
I think it's a combination. I mean, it's the things we just talked about, whether it's contract for difference, the discussions around royalty, et cetera. But we also need to have a really clear regulatory timeline. If we were to apply for the pipeline in sort of late 2023 and got approval by late 2024, then we or 2020, even mid 2025, we can probably make our construction timelines. But if that delays into 2026 or 2027, then there are some projects that don't actually require a pipeline that are further south towards the sequestration hub. But we would not be able to do the projects that rely on the pipeline if we can't get the pipeline approved.
Okay, final question, Mark, and this is kind of a big one. But I'm not asking you a question you haven't been asked 1,000 times, but I think it does need to be asked, is why should the government pay when the oil sands companies are incredibly profitable? And in their own investor presentations, they talk about how much more room there is to drive down their production costs and drive up the amount of free cash flow that they're going to produce. And I mean, they're pretty profitable. So why should the taxpayer be on the hook here if the companies can afford this themselves?
Well, I mean, as you know, it's a very cyclical industry. In 2020, all of these companies were losing money, and we're in kind of an unusual situation with the combination of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and lack of new large greenfield projects happening. So you've got a bit of a bubble right now that it won't necessarily be the case in 3 years or 5 years. But governments and therefore the people of Alberta and Canada are in many ways the biggest winner of growth in the industry. It's estimated that our companies will provide $50 billion in total to governments this year. So yes, they're extremely profitable for their shareholders, but they're also extremely beneficial for the people of Alberta and Canada. And in many ways, the Alberta royalty system already acts in some way as a bit of a windfall tax, because as companies achieve payout, which is happening more quickly, then obviously the royalties jump. So we're seeing bitumen royalties jump from about $1 billion to about $15 billion in the space of a year.
Okay, I want to push back a little bit on the argument that this is a cyclical industry. Yes, global markets have been cyclical, but if you look at the amount of investment, when investment in exploration and production globally fell off a cliff, and around 2015, 2016 is a third of what it was. And I don't know how many analysts I've seen saying that if that doesn't pick up, then there's going to be a shortage. The market's going to be tight going forward. Wood Mackenzie thinks that we're going to have $80 to $100 barrel on oil all decade long, maybe into the 2030s. That's not an uncommon view, and it seems like this is not business as usual. We're into a new era. Things are different, and I'm not sure that I buy the argument anymore that, well, this is cyclical. We're going to have losses 2 years from now because that's the way the industry's always worked. I don't know. I'm not convinced of that.
It was only 2 years ago that we were talking negative values. Within the last decade, we've talked about peak oil. I mean, like all these conversations come and go. I have no idea what the market is going to look like in in 10 years or 20 years. And really what we want to be able to do is to be the best producer possible, whether it's a $25 million, 25 million barrel a day market or 100 million barrel a day market. We want to be the low emissions, low cost, reliable, democratic provider of oil, no matter what the size of the market is that we're dealing with.
Okay. Is the industry competitive at 25 million barrels a day?
I mean, by 2050, I'd hope we would be. It'll depend, but there's an awful lot of water that has to go under the bridge between now and then. But if we've made these investments in decarbonization and we're producing essentially net zero oil in an affordable way, then I would think that this, Canadian oil sands could be a premium product that people will want to buy.
So it's carbon competitive. So we'll say by 2050, we'll give you the benefit of the doubt that you have decarbonized oil sands production. And in fact, the market, I was just looking at it, interviewed the Bloomberg NEF's head of oil analysis the other day, and demand from road transportation is going to decline quite a bit, but aviation and petrochemicals are forecast to rise. And heavy oil now gets used in petrochemical plants in Asia. So that might very well be the case. And the companies in the Pathways Alliance say that they're driving their production, their break evens down to anywhere from between $25 and $35 a barrel. So it looks to me like it would be competitive in a 20, I mean, maybe. Okay. So if you're arguing for a long-term future for the oil sands and carbon competitiveness is part of that, I don't know. That sounds to me like the industry should bear a bigger percentage of the costs here.
Well, I mean, obviously that's a discussion that we're having, but I think there's no question that investments that are purely in decarbonization that aren't contributing to additional growth or sales, there's got to be there's a public interest in that. And I think there's also a public interest in the long-term competitiveness of this industry. And what exactly the percentage is obviously something that the federal, provincial government and industry are all going to be talking about. I guess the other thing I'd add is there's a really important First Nations component here, and we'll want to see increased First Nations involvement in these kind of projects going forward as well.
Yeah, we'll come back to the First Nations on another interview. We've covered a lot of ground in this. I really appreciate the information you provided, Mark. So thank you very much for this.
Thank you.